The Mist of Blackwood, Chapter 1. The Distant Call. The smell of fresh ink and aged paper was Henry Fowler's perfume. His office on Fleet Street, London, was less a workplace than a sanctum. Walls lined with precarious towers of newspapers, maps curling at the edges, and manuscripts spotted with coffee stains. The city's endless buzz, horses' hooves, the metallic clatter of trams, the chorus of street vendors reached him only as a muffled undertone, like distant waves against the hull of a ship. Henry, a man with wire-rimmed spectacles and perpetually ink-stained fingers, was known among colleagues not for charm, but for his uncanny instinct. He lived for the hunt, not for animals, but for the kind of stories that resisted the daylight. He chased those that whispered in dark corners of pubs, that emerged from forgotten archives, or that arrived trembling in the anonymous hand of someone too afraid to sign their name. It was one such letter that pulled him from his comfortable routine. The envelope bore no seal, no return address. Its paper smelled faintly of damp earth, as though it had traveled through fog before reaching him. The script inside was elegant, yet strangely uneven. Letters that seemed to lean and sway across the page, as though the writer had fought against a trembling hand, or perhaps against something less tangible. Blackwood, the mist has taken them. They give up. That was all. No names, no dates. Just an address scrawled in the margin, pointing to a village he had never visited. Henry read it 3 times, the words lodging themselves in his mind like a splinter. They give up. On what? Life? Hope? Sanity? The phrasing troubled him. Not they are gone, not they are dead, but they give up. It sounded less like a statement of fact and more like a confession. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the smoke-stained ceiling. Blackwood. The name itself carried weight. A village hidden in the folds of England, the kind of place you might find in folklore collections alongside tales of standing stones and witches' covens. He pulled open a drawer and rifled through his files, maps, and old notes. But what little he uncovered about Blackwood was frustratingly thin. A remote wool-producing settlement, yes. But recent accounts spoke of a slow decline, an inexplicable thinning of its population. A handful of travelers had left vague reports, an ever-present mist, uncanny even for the English climate, that clung to the valley as if it belonged there. No violence, no epidemic, only absence, as though the place itself were devouring its people silently. Henry's pulse quickened. It was the kind of puzzle that appealed to his instincts, something half forgotten by the world, yet persistent enough to demand attention. For the next few days, he surrendered to the investigation. He traced the village's location on worn ordnance survey maps. The valley lay nestled between hills like silent sentinels, accessible only by a winding carriage road after the railway ended miles away. The more he studied, the more Blackwood's isolation became a character in itself, looming and suffocating. At night, the phrase from the letter echoed in his dreams. They give up. He woke with a taste of fog in his throat, though his window was shut. Finally, Henry resolved to go. He packed a battered leather suitcase, his trusty portable typewriter, and a few notebooks. His rational side told him the letter might be a hoax, an elaborate prank sent by someone amused at the thought of baiting an investigative journalist. Yet beneath that, skepticism stirred something deeper, a sensation he could neither explain nor dismiss. The day of his departure dawned gray. London's skyline, with its chimneys and spires, seemed reluctant to let him go. On the platform, the iron wheels screeched, and the train's steam enveloped him in a man-made fog. He couldn't help but shiver at the symbolism. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to fields washed in muted green, then to forests whose trees pressed closer to the tracks as though they were watching the train pass. The air grew heavier, moister. By the time the train rattled past the last station before Blackwood, condensation traced patterns on the glass, and a thin veil of mist pressed its face against the window like a curious child. Henry rested his forehead against the cold glass, watching as the world outside blurred. He knew this was just the beginning. The letter had promised a mystery, but the mist itself creeping, swallowing. Patient was already offering its own invitation. The harbinger of something deeper, denser, awaited him in Blackwood. Chapter 2. Roads of Mist. Henry's journey began beneath a sky suffocated by clouds, gray and swollen with the threat of rain. The daylight struggled to break through, turning the landscape into a world of blurred shapes and long shadows. The coach moved slowly along the winding road, its wheels groaning against gravel and mud. The horses' hooves struck the ground with a rhythm that was steady yet strangely hesitant, as if even the animals sensed they were crossing into a place that resisted their presence. The coachman, a tall, hollow-cheeked man wrapped in a threadbare cloak, spoke little. When he did, his voice was rough and uneven, as though the words were dragged reluctantly from his chest. His eyes, deep-set beneath a furrowed brow, never lingered on Henry for long. More often, they shifted nervously toward the forest that loomed in the distance, dark and silent against the horizon. For long stretches they traveled in silence, but silence here was not empty. It was broken by sudden gusts of wind that whistled through the crooked branches lining the road. The air carried strange murmurs, so faint that Henry could not tell if they were the rustling of leaves or something more uncanny, whispers shaped into words not meant for human ears. Unsettled, Henry pulled his coat tighter across his chest. The coachman, noticing the movement, muttered without turning his head, "The closer we draw to the wasteland, the more the wind remembers." Henry tried to draw him into conversation. He asked about the nearby villages, the condition of the roads, even the forest they were approaching. But the man answered only in fragments, as though each word had to be measured and weighed before it was spoken. At last, after a long silence, the coachman added in a low voice, "They say, if you listen long enough, you begin to understand. But not every soul is meant to hear." And with that, he closed his mouth firmly, as if speaking further would invite something unwelcome into their company. By the time the coach finally reached the outskirts of the village, night had fallen. Darkness gathered heavily around the clustered houses, which seemed to lean into one another as though cowering from the expanse of forest that stretched beyond. A handful of windows glimmered faintly with candlelight, but the glow was quickly smothered whenever footsteps echoed along the street, leaving the village shrouded in uneasy stillness. When Henry stepped down from the coach, he felt a chill run through him, not from the wind, but from the sensation of being watched. Faces seemed to hover behind shutters and narrow cracks in the wooden walls, eyes glimmering for the briefest instant before vanishing as he turned his head. The inn at the center of the square offered the only visible sign of welcome. A lantern burned dimly above the door, its flame quivering against the restless air. Inside, the warmth of the hearth did little to dispel the heaviness that clung to the room. An elderly woman, small and frail, stood behind the counter. Her posture was stiff, her movements careful, as though every gesture carried some unspoken burden. She handed Henry the key to his room with trembling hands. Her eyes darted to the window, then back to him, before she leaned closer. Her voice, hushed and brittle, carried a weight far greater than the words themselves. "Do not go into the forest." Chapter 3. Whispers between the houses. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of gray. Morning bled into dusk without much difference, for the mist seemed to devour the very notion of time. It lay over the village like a burial shroud, clinging to roofs, curling along the cobblestones, slipping in through cracks beneath doors and shutters. Even the air tasted of it cold, metallic, and faintly sweet, like the aftertaste of iron on the tongue. Henry tried to do what he always did: observe, ask questions, gather fragments of truth. But here, in Blackwood, truth was as evasive as sunlight. The villagers he approached greeted him with silence or with words stripped of life. A farmer with a back bent by decades of toil muttered only of the calm the mist brought. His eyes glazed and distant, as though he were speaking not to Henry but to some memory. A young woman who lingered by the well flinched when he asked about the disappearances, her lips trembling with an answer she never gave before retreating into the fog. It was not hostility he encountered, but something worse: resignation. A soft, pliant surrender that seemed to have spread through the people like a sickness. They did not resist the mist, nor did they fear it. They accepted it, as though their very will had been blunted and reshaped by its presence. Henry felt the unease pressing harder against him with each passing hour. The silence of the place was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of watchfulness, like a cathedral after the candles have gone out. At times, he thought he heard voices drifting on the fog, in distinct whispers, syllables carried just beyond the range of comprehension. When he turned, there was only emptiness. And yet, in that emptiness, he felt the unmistakable weight of being observed. At night, in his narrow bed beneath the warped beams of the inn, Henry struggled to sleep. The old woman who ran the place served him meals without comment, her face as hollow as the rest, but her eyes betrayed something fear, perhaps, or weariness too deep to name. He tried once to ask her directly about the mist, but she looked past him as though he were not there, and only muttered, "It lingers now. It does not leave." One evening, when the weight of unanswered questions grew unbearable, Henry roamed the inn with a lantern in hand. The corridors groaned under his steps, dust rising from the wooden planks as though stirred by unseen breaths. In his own room, the air felt heavier than before, damp in a way no closed window could explain. Something instinct, curiosity, desperation drew him to the floorboards near the bed, where the wood bowed slightly, as though straining under a hidden burden. With effort, he pried one loose. Beneath, wrapped in cloth blackened with age and moisture, lay a book, a diary. Its leather binding was cracked, its pages brittle and yellowed. The ink within had faded, but the handwriting remained elegant, though increasingly erratic in its later entries. The name on the first page stopped him. Dr. Alistair Finch, a naturalist, a botanist, who had come to Blackwood decades earlier. At first, Finch's notes were scientific, almost mundane records of flora, the peculiar dampness of the soil, the resilience of mosses that thrived in shade. But as the pages turned, the observations grew stranger. Finch began to speak of the mist not as weather, but as will. He wrote of nights where he felt watched though alone, of whispers that pressed against the inside of his skull, of shapes that moved where no shapes should be. He described villagers not as neighbors, but as hollowed shells, shadows of themselves, their souls drawn thinner by each passing day. The entries devolved into ramblings lines repeated over and over, ink smudged by trembling hands. Phrases like, "It calls me and I cannot keep it out," crowded the margins. In one frantic passage, Finch claimed the mist carried not moisture, but thought that it was a presence seeking communion. The final entry ended mid-sentence, the pen stroke tearing the paper as though ripped from his hand. "I give up." Henry sat in silence long after reading, the diary heavy in his hands. His heart thudded with both dread and fascination. This was no trick of paranoia, no simple weather anomaly. Others before him had felt it too. Others had stood on the precipice between resistance and surrender, and most had fallen, Closing the diary, Henry became aware of the room around him. The mist pressed against the window, thicker now, its surface rippling as if it breathed. For the first time, he could swear that the whispers outside were not random noise. They were words, faint but distinct, and among them, carried like a thread of smoke, was his own name, Henry. The lantern flame wavered. He felt the coldness seep through the floorboards and into his bones. The mist was no longer content to linger outside. It was at the threshold, waiting. Chapter 4. The Dance of Shadows. The diary never left Henry's side. By day, he kept it folded in his coat, the worn leather warm against his chest. By night, he read and reread its pages until the words seemed to crawl beneath his skin. The voice of Dr. Alistair Finch echoed through the entries like a man calling from the bottom of a well, his thoughts fragmented, his sanity frayed. Yet, in those pages, Henry found a strange companionship. Finch had walked this same path before him, and though it ended in madness, there was comfort in knowing he was not alone in the descent. But with each reading, Henry noticed something unsettling. The cadence of the diary seemed to shift. Phrases he did not recall were suddenly there, coiled between lines of ink, words that mirrored his own private fears. More than once he closed the book with a shudder, convinced the mist itself had found a way to write through Finch's hand, and now, perhaps, through his. He resolved to push beyond the village, into the woods where the mist was set to gather most thickly. A voice within whispered caution, but the greater voice, the journalist's instinct, sharpened by years of chasing the hidden and the unspeakable, demanded he go. At dawn, he set out with a lantern and a notebook, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The innkeeper watched from the threshold as he departed, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She did not try to stop him. Perhaps she already knew the futility of resistance. The forest welcomed him like a cathedral in ruin. Trees stretched overhead in grotesque arches, their branches twisted into shapes that clawed at the sky. The path dissolved almost immediately, swallowed by the wet earth and the clinging mist. Sound itself seemed muted. His footsteps struck the ground, yet produced no echo. Even the crows, perched like black punctuation marks upon skeletal branches, made no sound. It was then the whispers began. At first, distant and indistinct, like the sigh of a tide retreating. Then, sharper, more insistent syllables curling into his ear, familiar yet impossible. Some voices he thought he recognized. The farmer's, the young woman's, the cracked tone of the coachman. And then others, faces he had never seen, voices filled with longing, with resignation. Most chilling of all was the moment he heard his own name spoken in his own voice. Henry quickened his pace, though he knew not where the path led. Shapes stirred at the periphery of his vision, elongated figures, pallid and translucent, drifting between the trees. When he turned to face them, they dissolved into mist, leaving only the impression of eyes, wide and empty, watching. The deeper he walked, the stronger the sensation of trespass grew. The mist did not merely surround him. It moved with intent, thickening before him, thinning behind, guiding his steps as a shepherd herds his flock. He was no longer choosing his path. He was being led. At length, he stumbled upon a cabin half consumed by ivy and rot. Its door sagged from rusted hinges, and the roof bowed under years of dampness. The place reeked of mold, yet when Henry stepped inside, he found not abandonment, but presence. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of burnt herbs. Books lay scattered across the floor in heaps, pages warped by moisture, their spines marked with symbols he did not recognize. Upon a splintered table rested a tome, bound in leather that gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Its cover bore symbols that seemed to shift as he looked at them, as if the lines refused to remain still. He opened it with trembling hands. The script within was older, curling and ornate, yet he could decipher fragments, mentions of a mother of the mist, a presence older than the hills, revered once by the villagers, not as a terror, but as a goddess. The mist, the text claimed, was not weather, but womb, a living shroud that enfolded, dissolved, and remade. To merge with it was not death, but union. To resist was torment. Henry's vision wavered. The whispers grew louder, surging like waves against his skull. He felt a pressure inside his chest, as though the mist itself were reaching into him, testing the edges of his resolve. The shadows in the cabin shifted, stretching across the floorboards until they moved like figures in a dance, faces half-formed, limbs that twisted into formless smoke. He staggered back, clutching the diary to his chest, but the truth pressed in. The mist was not an atmosphere. It was a mind, and it hungered for his own. Outside, the forest had grown impenetrable. The way back was gone, consumed in gray. Only the whispers remained, coaxing, cajoling, patient. "Let go, Henry. The words are heavy. We will carry them for you." He tried to run, but the mist thickened at his feet, dragging like a tide. The shadows lengthened, converged, their hollow eyes fixed on him. He no longer knew whether he was awake or dreaming, whether this was the forest or a conjuring of his own unraveling mind. The lantern sputtered, its flame shrinking against the damp air. As it died, Henry saw them faces within the mist, countless and familiar, the villagers, Dr. Finch, others long forgotten. They did not cry out, nor did they mourn. They only moved in rhythm, a slow, inevitable dance, their mouths opening in silence as though to invite him to join. And then, for the first time, Henry felt not only fear, but temptation. Chapter 5. The Weight of Surrender. The cabin's shadows clung to Henry long after he fled its rotting threshold. The words of the tome, the mother of the mist, the promise of union pressed against his skull with suffocating insistence. He staggered through the trees, lantern dead in his hand, the fog curling tighter around his body as if to claim him with every faltering step. Time fractured. He could not say if he wandered for minutes or days. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned. Yet these sensations seemed pale compared to the deeper assault, the erosion of his own mind. The mist seeped into thought, blurring memory and imagination alike. Faces surfaced, unbidden colleagues from London, strangers glimpsed on carriages, even his mother long dead, only to dissolve into vapor, their voices carried away in whispers. At last, stumbling and half delirious, Henry collapsed beside a fallen tree. The soil beneath him was slick and cold, smelling of decay. He fumbled for his notebook, his last tether to coherence, and began to write. His hand shook, the letters sprawling like broken branches across the page. He recorded the date, though he no longer trusted the calendar. He described the mist as if naming it could give shape to what defied language. "It whispers not from without, but within," he scrawled. "It knows the pattern of thought. It waits in the hollow places. It is patient, patient as stone." The act of writing steadied him, if only for moments. Words became anchors, fragments of resistance driven into shifting ground. Yet, as the ink spread, he saw lines he did not recall writing, sentences bent in a voice not entirely his own. "You are weary. We can rest for you. You are alone. We are here. Let go, Henry." He dropped the pen, his breath ragged. The notebook trembled in his grip, as though it had become an instrument of the mist itself. Still, he clung to it, for without the act of writing, his mind threatened to dissolve into the formless silence pressing against him. Night fell, or what passed for night, beneath the pall of fog. Henry sought shelter in the hollow of a tree, but the mist coiled inside with him, damp and intimate. He closed his eyes, yet visions surged in the darkness behind them. The villagers, their faces emptied of struggle, drifting as one through the streets. Dr. Puey, Finch, seated at a desk identical to Henry's own, repeating the words "I give up" until ink swallowed the page. Sleep brought no relief. Dreams became corridors of fog, endless and echoing. At the end of each stood a figure, sometimes a child, sometimes a faceless woman, sometimes Henry himself, arms open, waiting, always waiting. When he woke, his resolve was thinner, his limbs heavy, his thoughts fractured. He felt less like a man resisting, and more like a man being carried by a current. To fight seemed not only impossible, but unnecessary, like struggling against the tide of the sea. Yet deep within, a stubborn spark lingered. He thought of Fleet Street, of ink and newsprint, of stories wrested from silence and shadows. He thought of his typewriter, the sound of his keys a hammer against oblivion. He thought of the letter that had brought him here, the trembling words, "They give up." And he whispered to the empty air, "I will not." The mist stirred, as though amused by his defiance. The whispers rose, not in anger, but in something softer, almost maternal. They came not as command, but as comfort. "You resist because you are tired. We resist nothing. We are peace. Come and see." Henry rose on trembling legs, clutching his notebook like a relic. He knew the struggle was futile, perhaps even foolish. But for now, he chose it. Each step forward was a denial. Each word he scratched onto the page, an act of rebellion against the quiet embrace waiting just beyond. Still, he felt it deep in his marrow, in the hollow spaces of his mind. The longer he lingered, the closer he drifted toward that final yielding. Resistance was not strength, but delay, and delay could not last forever. The mist did not hurry. It had eternity. Chapter 6. The Threshold. Henry no longer knew where the forest ended, and he began. Each step was slower, heavier, as if the mist had wound itself into his veins, thickening the blood, softening the will. His notebook hung limp in his hand, its pages warped by dampness, ink bleeding like veins into pale paper. He had written until words no longer obeyed him, until the sentences curved away into nonsense, until the lines dissolved into shapes that resembled not language but breathing. The whispers no longer came from without. They pulsed behind his eyes, threaded through his thoughts, indistinguishable from memory. Sometimes it was his mother's voice, soothing, sometimes Finch's frantic, sometimes his own, weary and resigned. All bore the same refrain: let go. The fog thickened until he could see only the space of an arm's reach ahead. Yet within that narrow span moved figures half seen, half felt, faces serene, eyes hollow. The villagers, the travelers, Finch. Each one turned to him with an expression that was neither pleading nor threatening, but welcoming, as if inviting him to step into the rhythm they had already joined. And for a moment, an eternity contained in a heartbeat, Henry understood. They were not suffering. They were not lost. They were whole, folded into something larger, something beyond pain, beyond solitude. What they had surrendered was not life, but burden. His knees gave way, and he sank to the damp earth. The mist enveloped him like arms, cold yet tender, pulling close. The chorus swelled, not voices anymore, but a tide, a vastness into which his own thoughts thinned like ink in water. But then faint, flickering another image, intruded. A cluttered office on Fleet Street, ink-stained pages piled high. The metallic clatter of typewriter keys. His sanctuary, his hunt. The pulse of the city beyond the window, restless, alive. The memory burned for an instant, fragile and defiant, like a candle guttering in a storm. The mist pressed harder. Patient, inevitable, Henry's lips parted. A breath escaped, whether a surrender or a final resistance, none could say. The fog closed in, and in Blackwood, silence endured,